A millionaire cut his wife's hair as punishment for being too kind. After doing it, he mocked her, saying, "Now no one will look at you anymore." But what she did the next day shocked everyone and left the millionaire completely speechless. Watch this incredible story of resilience until the end. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. Victoria Marshall stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse apartment, watching the sunset paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and pink. The diamond on her finger caught the light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the imported marble floors. From this height, the city looked like a perfectly arranged dollhouse, each building and street meticulously placed to create an illusion of order and control. She remembered the day Alexander Blackwood had proposed just 6 months ago. It had been a fairy tale moment, the kind little girls dream about. He had rented out the entire Rainbow Room, hired a string quartet, and gotten down on one knee as the city twinkled 65 stories below them. The ring he'd chosen was flawless, like everything else about him. His tailored suits, his commanding presence, his carefully calculated charm. Mrs. Blackwood, she whispered to her reflection, testing the name that still felt foreign on her tongue. The woman staring back at her was everything she'd dreamed of becoming. Perfectly styled hair, designer clothes, impeccable makeup. Alexander had insisted on hiring a personal stylist for her, claiming that as his wife she needed to maintain a certain image. "It's about presenting ourselves as a power couple," he'd explained, with that indulgent smile that made her feel simultaneously special and somehow lacking. The sound of the private elevator's distinctive chime pulled her from her reverie. Alexander was home early. Victoria quickly smoothed her hair and checked her lipstick. He noticed everything, and lately, his comments about her appearance had become more frequent, more pointed. "Darling?" His voice carried through their sprawling apartment, warm and commanding at the same time. The sound of his Italian leather shoes against the marble floor created a steady rhythm that matched her quickening heartbeat. "In here?" she called back, pasting on the bright smile he expected. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his 6'2" frame filling the space with an energy that seemed to compress the air in the room. He was devastatingly handsome in his bespoke suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his green eyes sharp and assessing as they swept over her. "You changed your hair," he said, crossing the room to kiss her cheek. It wasn't a question. "The new style makes your face look rounder." His tone was casual, but Victoria felt her stomach tighten. She'd only had the ends trimmed, barely an inch, but of course he'd noticed. "I thought it needed a refresh," she said carefully, watching his reflection in the window. "But if you don't like it—" "I prefer it longer," he interrupted, his hand coming to rest at the nape of her neck. His touch was gentle, but she felt the slight pressure of his fingers against her spine. "You know how I love your long hair. It's one of the things that caught my attention when we first met." Victoria nodded, remembering their first encounter at the charity gala where she'd been working as an event coordinator. She'd spent hours making sure every detail was perfect, only to have the guest speaker cancel at the last minute. Alexander had stepped in smoothly, delivering an impromptu speech that had the wealthy donors reaching for their checkbooks. Afterward, he'd sought her out, complimenting her crisis management skills and her stunning hair. She'd been captivated by his confidence, his easy authority, the way he seemed to know exactly what he wanted and how to get it. "I have a surprise for you," Alexander announced, turning her to face him. His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes, in a way that made her heart flutter. These were the moments she lived for now, when she could glimpse the man she'd fallen in love with. "I've arranged for us to spend the weekend at the vineyard. Just us, away from the city, from all the distractions. We haven't had much time together lately, with the merger keeping me at the office." Victoria's smile froze slightly. The vineyard was Alexander's pride and joy, a sprawling estate in the Hudson Valley where they'd spent their honeymoon. It was beautiful, isolated, and completely under his control. The staff there answered only to him. The security system was state-of-the-art and cell service was conveniently spotty. That sounds wonderful, she heard herself say, even as her pulse quickened. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning. I've already had Clara pack your bags. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. You've seemed distracted lately, darling. This will be good for us. A chance to reconnect, to remind ourselves of what's important. Victoria nodded, maintaining her smile, even as she felt the walls of their perfect life closing in around her. Through the window, she watched the last rays of sunlight fade, leaving the city in shadows. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, distant and cold, like the glitter of diamonds on a velvet display case. Beautiful, precious, and completely trapped. The helicopter ride to the vineyard was smooth, but Victoria's stomach churned with every mile that carried them further from Manhattan. Alexander sat beside her, one hand resting possessively on her knee as he discussed business on his phone. She stared out the window, watching the urban landscape give way to rolling hills and carefully tended rows of grapevines. Beautiful, isn't it? Alexander's voice startled her. He had finished his call and was watching her with that intense gaze that used to make her feel like the most important person in the world. Now it made her feel like a butterfly pinned to a display, bored. I remember how your eyes lit up the first time I brought you here. Victoria smiled, remembering that day too. She had been dazzled by the estate's grandeur, the historic mansion with its sweeping staircases, the wine cellar stocked with bottles worth more than her yearly salary, the gardens that looked like they belonged in a European palace. Everything about it had seemed magical, like stepping into a different world. It hasn't changed, she said softly, and it was true. The estate was as perfect as ever, preserved in amber like a beautiful insect frozen in time. The helicopter touched down on the private helipad, and Alexander helped her out with the gallant courtesy he always displayed in front of others. The estate manager, Reynolds, was waiting to greet them, his expression carefully neutral as he took in Victoria's designer outfit and Alexander's proprietary hand at the small of her back. Everything has been prepared according to your specifications, Mr. Blackwood, Reynolds said, falling into step beside them as they walked toward the house. The chef has planned the menu you requested, and the wine cellar has been restocked with the new vintages you wanted to try. Excellent. Alexander's approval was warm, but measured. And the other arrangements? All taken care of, sir. The security system has been upgraded as requested, and the new staff have been fully briefed on protocols. Victoria's step faltered slightly at this exchange, but Alexander's hand steadied her, his grip tightening imperceptibly. She had learned to read these small gestures, to understand the language of control expressed through touches that looked loving to outside observers. Inside the mansion, everything was immaculate, as though the house had been waiting in suspended animation for their arrival. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases, their scent almost overwhelming in the enclosed space. The furniture gleamed with polish, and the floors shone like mirrors, reflecting the crystal chandelier that hung in the foyer. Why don't you freshen up before dinner? Alexander suggested, though it wasn't really a suggestion. I had Clara pack that new blue dress I bought you, the one that matches your eyes. Victoria nodded and headed upstairs, her heels clicking against the marble steps. In their bedroom suite, she found her suitcase already unpacked, everything arranged precisely the way Alexander preferred. The blue dress hung in the closet, still wrapped in designer tissue paper. As she changed, Victoria caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror. The dress was beautiful, clinging to her curves in a way that was elegant rather than provocative. Alexander was very specific about the difference. The color did match her eyes, making them look larger and more luminous. She looked like a woman who had everything, who lived a life others envied. But as she stared at her reflection, she noticed something that made her breath catch. On the dresser behind her was a small, innocuous white box that hadn't been there during their last visit. It was the kind used by high-end jewelry stores, the type that usually contained some extravagant gift from Alexander. But there was something about its placement, about the way it sat just slightly off-center on the polished wood, that made her pulse quicken. She approached it slowly, her reflection growing larger in the mirror with each step. The box was unmarked. its white surface pristine except for a single fingertip smudge on one corner. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a pair of scissors. They were beautiful in their way, sterling, silver, intricately engraved with flowing patterns that caught the light. But Victoria knew they weren't meant for opening packages or trimming flowers. They were a message, a warning wrapped in the guise of a gift. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her snap the box shut. She turned to face the door just as Alexander entered, his smile warm and appreciative as he took in her appearance in the blue dress. "Perfect," he said, crossing the room to stand behind her. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, and in the mirror they looked like a portrait of marital bliss, the successful businessman and his beautiful wife, surrounded by luxury and refinement. "You see, this is how I always want you to look. This is the woman I married." Victoria met his eyes in the reflection, forcing herself to smile even as she felt the weight of the scissors' presence behind them, hidden but impossible to ignore. The perfect life she'd thought she was stepping into was revealing itself for what it truly was. A beautiful cage, crafted with expert precision, its bars made of golden threads that grew tighter with each passing day. Dinner at the vineyard was always an elaborate affair, even when it was just the two of them. Victoria sat across from Alexander at the long mahogany table, watching the candlelight dance across the fine bone china and crystal stemware. The chef had outdone himself with a 5-course meal paired with wines from Alexander's private collection. "Try the Bordeaux," Alexander suggested, gesturing to the deep red liquid in her glass. "It's from a small vineyard in France. The owner only produces a few hundred bottles each year." His voice carried that hint of pride he always had when sharing his exclusive possessions. Victoria lifted the glass, taking a small sip. The wine was complex and rich, with notes of blackberry and oak. "It's wonderful," she said, knowing he expected her appreciation of the finer things he'd introduced into her life. "I knew you'd understand its quality." His smile was approving. "You've come so far from the girl who used to drink cheap Chardonnay at charity events. Remember how little you knew about wine when we first met?" The comment stung as it was meant to, another subtle reminder of how he'd elevated her, transformed her from a simple event coordinator into Mrs. Alexander Blackwood. These reminders had become more frequent lately, each one a tiny crack in her confidence. "I had a call today from the Thompson Foundation," Alexander continued, cutting into his perfectly cooked duck breast. "They're hosting their annual gala next month. They asked if you'd be willing to join the planning committee given your previous experience." Victoria's heart jumped at the prospect of doing something meaningful again, something that was hers. "That would be wonderful," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "I've missed event planning." Alexander's knife scraped against the plate, the sound sharp in the quiet dining room. "I told them you were unfortunately too busy with our own charitable endeavors." His tone was gentle, reasonable. "Besides, darling, it wouldn't be appropriate for my wife to work as an event planner. What would people think?" "Of course," Victoria murmured, looking down at her plate. "You're right." But inside something shifted like a key turning in a lock. She remembered how alive she'd felt coordinating events, the satisfaction of seeing months of planning come together perfectly, the pride in building something on her own. "I have something for you," Alexander said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box, not white this time, but deep blue, a little surprise to celebrate our weekend together. Victoria accepted the box with steady hands, though her heart was racing. Inside was a diamond bracelet, each stone perfectly matched and glittering in the candlelight. It was exquisite, and probably cost more than her entire wardrobe from before their marriage. "Let me," Alexander said, rising from his chair. He came around the table and took the bracelet, his fingers brushing against her wrist as he fastened. The diamonds felt cold against her skin, like tiny ice crystals. "Beautiful," he murmured, but he wasn't looking at the bracelet. His eyes were fixed on her face, watching for her reaction. "Thank you," she said softly, turning her wrist to make the diamonds catch the light. "It's perfect." The word felt bitter on her tongue. "You deserve beautiful things," Alexander said. still standing behind her chair. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, thumbs pressing slightly into the tense muscles at the base of her neck. "You're my greatest investment, Victoria. Everything I do is to make you perfect." The pressure of his hands increased slightly, and Victoria forced herself to relax under his touch. But her mind was racing, remembering all the other investments he'd made in her: the personal stylist who replaced her entire wardrobe, the etiquette coach who corrected her table manners, the personal trainer who helped her lose the 10 pounds Alexander had subtly suggested she didn't need. "I've been thinking," Alexander continued, moving back to his seat, "that it's time we started planning for our future. Children specifically." He took a sip of wine, watching her over the rim of his glass. "The Blackwood name needs an heir." Victoria felt the room tilt slightly, though she hadn't drunk enough wine to be dizzy. "Children?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, it's the natural next step." Alexander's tone was matter-of-fact, as if they were discussing a business merger rather than creating a family. "I've already spoken with Dr. Harrison about having your birth control implant removed. He can see you next week." The diamonds on her wrist suddenly felt heavier, like shackles. She hadn't even known Alexander was aware of her birth control method. She'd had the implant placed years before meeting him. The fact that he'd discussed it with her doctor without consulting her made her stomach churn. "Shouldn't we talk about this first?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "It's a big decision." Alexander's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "What's there to discuss? We're married, we're financially secure, and you're not getting any younger. Besides," he added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you'll be a wonderful mother. I'll make sure of it." Victoria nodded slowly, buying time by taking another sip of wine. Through the window behind Alexander, she could see their reflection. In the darkened glass, the perfect couple having a perfect dinner in their perfect world. But now she could see the cracks in that reflection, spreading like spider webs across the surface of their carefully constructed life. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, autumn painting the vineyard in shades of gold and crimson. Victoria stood on the bedroom balcony, wrapped in a cashmere robe, watching the estate come to life. Workers moved through the vine rows like ants, their movements precise and coordinated. Everything here operated according to Alexander's exacting standards. She'd barely slept, the conversation about children playing on repeat in her mind. The thought of bringing a child into this golden cage made her chest tight with anxiety. A baby would bind her to Alexander permanently, give him another tool for control. And yet, the idea of motherhood stirred something deep inside her. A yearning for genuine love, for a connection uncomplicated by power dynamics and perfect appearances. "Mrs. Blackwood," a quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Maria, one of the newer maids, standing in the doorway. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to remind you about breakfast on the terrace. He's waiting." Victoria noticed the slight tremor in Maria's voice, the way the young woman's eyes darted around the room instead of meeting her gaze directly. She recognized the signs. She'd developed the same nervous habits herself over the past months. "Thank you, Maria," Victoria smiled warmly, trying to put the maid at ease. "Could you help me choose a suitable outfit? I'm still learning all the proper combinations." It was a lie. Alexander's stylist had left detailed instructions for every possible occasion, but Victoria had learned that small acts of kindness could build important bridges. As Maria helped her select a cream-colored silk blouse and tailored trousers, Victoria caught glimpses of her own story in the maid's careful movements and downcast eyes. "How long have you been working here, Maria?" 3 months, Mrs. Blackwood." Maria's hands shook slightly as she buttoned the blouse. "Mr. Blackwood was very generous to give me this opportunity after my previous situation." Victoria noted the pause, the unspoken story behind those words. "Do you like it here?" she asked softly, making sure her voice wouldn't carry beyond the room. Maria's fingers stilled for a moment. "It's very structured," she said finally. "Everything has its place, its purpose." Their eyes met in the mirror, and Victoria saw understanding flash between them, the recognition of shared experience, of lives carefully contained and controlled. "Yes," Victoria said, touching the diamond bracelet she still wore from the night before. Everything has its purpose here. Breakfast on the terrace was an elaborate affair, despite being just the two of them. Alexander sat at the head of the table, reading financial reports on his tablet while selecting pieces of fresh fruit from a crystal bowl. He looked up as Victoria approached, his eyes scanning her outfit with practiced efficiency. "You look lovely, darling," he said, setting aside his tablet, "though perhaps the blouse is a bit informal for breakfast at the estate." Victoria felt Maria tense behind her as she poured coffee. "I thought it would be nice for a casual morning," she replied, keeping her voice light, "but I can change if you prefer." Alexander waved his hand dismissively. "No need. We'll be having guests for lunch. The Harrises are driving up from the city. You can change then." He took a sip of coffee, then frowned slightly. "Maria, the coffee is too hot. Please bring a fresh cup at the proper temperature." "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." Maria hurried away, her head bowed. "Good help is so hard to find," Alexander sighed, returning to his tablet. "Though Maria shows promise, she's very grateful for the position, especially given her background. Did you know her ex-husband was abusive? Terrible situation. I gave her this job as a fresh start." He looked up, his green eyes intense. "I've always believed in helping people improve their lives, giving them structure and purpose. Don't you agree?" Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The parallels were too clear. Maria's gratitude, her careful movements, the way Alexander positioned himself as her savior. How many others had there been? How many women had he helped by bringing them into his web of control? "The Harrises," she said, changing the subject. "Will they be staying for dinner?" "No, just lunch. Thomas wants to discuss the new security system we're implementing at the estate. He's very impressed with our setup here." Alexander smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, an intimate gesture that once made her heart race with excitement, but now felt like another form of restraint. "I was thinking you could wear that new red dress for lunch, the one we bought in Milan." Victoria nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. The Harrises meant witnesses, outside observers who might notice things, might ask questions. Thomas Harris was one of the few people Alexander considered an equal, and his wife Caroline was known for her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. More importantly, they represented a connection to the outside world, a reminder that life existed beyond the estate's manicured borders. As if reading her thoughts, Alexander added, "Oh, and darling, let's keep our discussion about children between us for now. No need to share our personal plans with others." "Of course," Victoria agreed, sipping her perfectly temperature-controlled coffee. But inside, something was shifting, like tectonic plates before an earthquake. The arrival of the Harrises, Maria's story, the diamond bracelet that felt more like a warning than a gift, all of it was coming together in her mind, forming a picture she couldn't ignore any longer. Victoria stood in front of her closet, running her fingers along the row of designer dresses until she found the red Milan creation Alexander had specified. The fabric was exquisite, a deep crimson silk that caught the light like liquid rubies. She'd worn it only once before, at a charity gala where Alexander had proudly introduced her to his most influential business associates. As she dressed, she could hear Alexander's voice drifting up from below, giving instructions to the staff about lunch. His tone was pleasant but firm, brooking no argument or deviation from his expectations. The sound made her hands shake slightly as she fastened the delicate buttons down the back of the dress. A soft knock at the door made her start. "Come in," she called, expecting Maria, but it was Caroline Harris who stepped into the room. The older woman was elegant as always in a tailored navy suit, her silver hair swept into a classic chignon. "Victoria, darling," Caroline said, air-kissing her cheeks, "I hope you don't mind me coming up. The men are deep in discussion about their security systems, and I simply couldn't pretend to be interested for another minute." "Of course not," Victoria replied, genuinely pleased to see her. Caroline had always been kind to her in her own sharp-edged way. "I'm just finishing getting ready for lunch." Caroline's keen eyes took in the room, noting the perfectly arranged surfaces, the absence of personal items. "Red suits you," she said, gesturing to the dress, "though I remember when you used to wear more comfortable clothes before Alexander decided to upgrade your wardrobe." There was something in Caroline's tone that made Victoria look up sharply. The older woman was watching her with an expression that seemed almost concerned. "Alexander has excellent taste," Victoria said automatically, the words falling from her lips like well-rehearsed lines. Caroline moved to the window, looking out over the vineyard. "You know, I've known Alexander for many years, since before his first marriage." Victoria's hand stilled on the dress. "First marriage?" The words came out barely above a whisper. Caroline turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Oh dear, he hasn't mentioned Sophia. How typical." She crossed the room, closing the bedroom door quietly before continuing. "I suppose he wouldn't. It ended rather abruptly. She left him after only 8 months. No one knows exactly why. She simply disappeared one day. Alexander was devastated, of course, threw himself into his work, built this place as a sort of refuge." Victoria's mind was racing. Alexander had never mentioned a previous marriage. She'd assumed she was his first wife, given his apparent devotion to traditional values and family legacy. "What happened to her?" Victoria asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Caroline shrugged elegantly. "That's the curious thing, no one knows. She vanished completely. No social media, no credit card trails, nothing. Alexander hired private investigators, of course, but they never found her. It was quite the scandal in our circles, though it was all kept very quiet. Alexander can be quite persuasive when he wants something kept private." Before Victoria could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Caroline quickly moved to the vanity, picking up a perfume bottle as if examining it. The door opened, and Alexander appeared, his expression shifting minutely when he saw Caroline. "Ladies," he said smoothly, though Victoria noticed the tension in his shoulders, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Caroline replied, with a practiced smile. "I was just admiring Victoria's perfume collection. You always did have excellent taste in fragrances, Alexander. Remember that lovely scent Sophia used to wear? What was it called?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Alexander's face remained pleasant, but his eyes had turned to ice. "I'm afraid I don't recall," he said coldly. "Victoria, darling, lunch is ready. Caroline, Thomas is looking for you." As they made their way downstairs, Victoria felt Alexander's hand at the small of her back, guiding her. His touch was gentle, but she could feel the barely contained tension in his fingers. The mention of Sophia had clearly rattled him, cracking his perfect composure. Lunch was served in the formal dining room, the table set with the finest china and crystal. Thomas Harris, a distinguished man in his 60s, dominated the conversation with talk of security innovations and digital surveillance. Victoria noticed how Alexander kept steering the discussion toward specific features: cameras with facial recognition, GPS tracking systems, sophisticated alarm protocols. "The new system will cover every inch of the estate," Alexander was saying, his voice filled with satisfaction. "No one can enter or leave without my knowledge. It's about protection. Of course, keeping what's precious safe." His eyes met Victoria's across the table, and in that moment she understood with perfect clarity that the security system wasn't just about keeping people out, it was about keeping them in. She thought of Sophia, who had somehow managed to disappear despite Alexander's resources and connections. She thought of Maria, trapped in another kind of prison, grateful for the gilded cage that had replaced her previous one. Under the table, her fingers touched the diamond bracelet, feeling the cold stones against her skin. Each diamond felt like a tiny camera, watching, recording, controlling. But now, with the knowledge of Sophia's existence, something else had changed. If one woman had managed to escape Alexander's perfect world, perhaps it was possible to find cracks in his system, weaknesses in his careful control. Caroline's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp as a blade. "Alexander, you simply must show Thomas the wine cellar. He's been dying to see your new collection." Victoria watched as Alexander hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her alone with Caroline. But social protocol won out. He could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from his guests. "Of course," he said finally, rising from his chair. "Victoria, why don't you show Caroline the new rose garden while we're gone? But be careful, darling. Some of the thorns can be quite sharp." The threat in his words was subtle, but clear. As the men left the room, Victoria felt Caroline's hand slip into hers under the table, pressing something small and hard into her palm. When she looked down, she saw a tiny USB drive, no larger than her thumbnail. The rose garden was Alexander's pride and joy, second only to his wine collection. Each bush had been carefully cultivated to produce perfect blooms. Their thorns, as sharp as their petals, were soft. Victoria led Caroline through the winding paths, her mind racing with questions about the USB drive, now burning a hole in her dress pocket. "Lovely roses," Caroline commented, her voice carrying naturally in case anyone was listening. "Though I've always preferred wildflowers myself, so much more resilient." She paused by a white rose bush, her fingers hovering over a bloom. "Did you know that roses can grow anywhere, even in the harshest conditions? Nature always finds a way to survive." Victoria understood the metaphor. "These ones only grow because of constant care and control," she said carefully. "Without the proper structure, they'd wither." Would they? Caroline's eyes were sharp. Or would they simply grow differently, become something new, something unexpected? She glanced around the garden, noting the security cameras disguised as decorative elements among the foliage. Sometimes the strongest plants are the ones that break free from their carefully tended beds. They walked in silence for a moment, maintaining the appearance of a casual garden tour. Victoria's mind was working furiously, processing everything she'd learned about Sophia, wondering what secrets the USB drive might contain. "The thing about perfect gardens," Caroline continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "is that they require constant maintenance. One missed detail, one moment of inattention, and everything can change." She stopped, pretending to admire a particularly stunning red rose. "Thomas and I are leaving for Europe next week. Extended vacation. Will be unreachable for at least a month." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. Caroline was offering her a window, a period of time when Alexander couldn't use the Harrises to track her. But why was Caroline helping her? As if reading her thoughts, the older woman spoke again. "I knew Sophia, you know, before and after. She was like you, bright, capable, full of life. I watched her fade like a flower being slowly drained of color. When she disappeared, Caroline's voice caught slightly. "I should have helped her sooner. I won't make the same mistake twice." A noise from the house made them both turn. Alexander and Thomas were emerging onto the terrace, deep in conversation. Victoria could see the tension in Alexander's stance, the way his eyes immediately sought her out in the garden. "Look at your dress, darling," he called out, his voice carrying across the garden. "You're getting dirt on the hem. Come inside where it's safe." Victoria looked down at her pristine dress, understanding the real message behind his words. Everything about her was expected to remain perfect, untouched by the messy reality of the natural world. "Of course," she called back, forcing a smile. "Caroline was just telling me about her upcoming trip to Europe. It sounds wonderful." Alexander's expression flickered slightly. He hadn't known about the Harrises' travel plans. Victoria saw his hands clench briefly before he relaxed them, his control reasserting itself. "How lovely," he said smoothly, "though I can't imagine wanting to leave all this behind. We have everything we need right here, don't we, darling?" Victoria nodded, playing her part perfectly. But inside, her mind was already racing ahead, analyzing possibilities, looking for weaknesses in the carefully constructed walls of her prison. The USB drive felt like a key burning in her pocket, a potential path to freedom. As they walked back to the house, Victoria noticed Maria watching from an upstairs window, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. How many others were trapped in Alexander's web of control? How many others had he saved, only to imprison them in different ways? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of perfect manners and careful conversations. Victoria played her role flawlessly, smiling at the right moments, making appropriate comments about the wine and the weather. But underneath her polished exterior, something had fundamentally changed. The knowledge of Sophia's escape, the weight of the USB drive in her pocket, Caroline's subtle support, all of it combined to create a spark of hope she hadn't dared feel before. As she watched the Harris's car disappear down the long driveway, Alexander's arm around her waist in a gesture that looked loving but felt like restraint, Victoria made a decision. She would find out what happened to Sophia. She would discover how the other woman had managed to disappear so completely that even Alexander's resources couldn't track her down. "Tired, darling?" Alexander asked, noticing her distraction. "Perhaps you should lie down before dinner. You look a bit pale." "That's a good idea," Victoria agreed, letting him guide her toward the stairs. "I should rest." "I'll have Maria bring you some tea," he said, kissing her forehead. "The perfect remedy for any distressing thoughts." As Victoria climbed the stairs, she could feel Alexander's eyes on her back, watching, always watching. But for the first time, she felt something other than fear under his gaze. She felt purpose. The USB drive in her pocket might hold the key to her freedom, but she would have to be careful, patient, perfect in her performance until the right moment arrived. The bedroom was silent except for the soft hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of workers in the vineyard. Victoria sat at her vanity, pretending to arrange her hair while her mind raced with possibilities. The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in her dress pocket, but she knew she couldn't risk examining it yet. Alexander had cameras everywhere, and she couldn't be sure which ones were active at any given moment. Maria arrived with the promised tea, her movements careful and precise as she set the delicate porcelain cup on the bedside table. Victoria caught her eye in the mirror, seeing the same trapped look she'd noticed earlier. "Will there be anything else, Mrs. Blackwood?" Maria asked, her voice professionally neutral. Victoria made a show of considering, then said, "Actually, yes, could you help me with my laptop? I'm having trouble with some files and I know you used to work in tech support." It was a gamble. She had no idea about Maria's background, but she needed an ally, and something in the young woman's eyes told her she could be trusted. Maria's expression flickered with surprise, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood. What seems to be the problem?" Victoria moved to her desk, opening her laptop, the one Alexander had given her, complete with monitoring software she was sure he used to track her activities. "I'm trying to organize my charitable foundation files," she said loudly enough, for any listening devices to pick up. Then, more quietly as Maria leaned over her shoulder, "Do you know anything about surveillance systems?" Maria's hands stilled on the keyboard for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, my ex-husband was obsessed with control. I learned a lot about how to work around it." Victoria felt a surge of hope. She pulled up a document about the charitable foundation, making a show of discussing file organization while she slipped the USB drive into Maria's hand. "Could you check these files for corruption? I'm worried about losing important data." Maria's fingers closed around the drive, understanding flickering in her eyes. "Of course. It might take a few hours to run a complete diagnostic. Would you like me to work on it in the staff quarters? The connection is better there." "Perfect," Victoria said louder now. "Just make sure everything is properly backed up. The foundation records are very important to Alexander." As Maria left with the laptop and the hidden drive, Victoria felt her mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had just taken her first real step toward, freedom, understanding. She wasn't sure yet, but the simple act of defiance made her feel more alive than she had in months. She spent the next hour exactly as Alexander would expect, resting on the bed, sipping her tea, maintaining the image of the perfect, slightly delicate wife. When he came to check on her, she gave him a drowsy smile. "Feeling better, darling?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. His hand came to rest on her ankle, a gesture that looked caring but felt possessive. "Much better," she said. "Though I'm a bit worried about the foundation files. I asked Maria to help organize them properly. I want everything to be perfect for the next board meeting." Alexander's expression softened with approval. "That's my girl. Always thinking about appearances." He squeezed her ankle gently. though I'm not sure Maria is qualified for such important work. Perhaps I should have my assistant take a look instead." "Oh, no need," Victoria said quickly, keeping her voice casual. "Maria mentioned she has experience with file systems from her previous job. And it's good to give the staff additional responsibilities, isn't it? Shows them we trust them." She held her breath, watching Alexander process this. She knew he prided himself on being a benevolent employer, on helping people reach their potential under his guidance. "You're right," he said finally. "It's good to see you taking such an interest in managing the household staff. You're learning." The praise was genuine, but it carried an edge that made Victoria's skin crawl. "I had a good teacher," she replied, playing her role perfectly. "Everything I know about managing people I learned from you." Alexander smiled, clearly pleased by her response. "Rest now," he said, standing. "I have some business calls to make, but I'll have the chef prepare something special for dinner." "To celebrate." "Celebrate?" Victoria asked, her heart rate picking up. "I made an appointment with Dr. Harrison for next week," he said, his voice warm but brooking no argument. "For the procedure we discussed. It's time to start our family, don't you think?" Victoria forced herself to smile, to look excited rather than terrified. "So soon?" "No time like the present." Alexander leaned down to kiss her forehead. "You'll be a wonderful mother, Victoria. I'll make sure of it." After he left, Victoria lay in the perfect bed, in the perfect room, feeling anything but perfect. The thought of bringing a child into this situation made her physically ill, but she pushed the panic down, focusing instead on what needed to be done. Maria would need time to examine the USB drive safely. Victoria would need to maintain her performance, keep Alexander from suspecting anything was amiss. She got up and walked to the window, looking out over the vineyard. The sun was starting to set, painting the rows of grapes in shades of gold and shadow. Somewhere out there, Sophia had found a way to break free from all this perfection. Now Victoria just had to figure out how she'd done it. A movement caught her eye. Maria crossing the courtyard with Victoria's laptop tucked under her arm. Their eyes met briefly through the window, and Maria gave an almost imperceptible nod. Whatever was on that drive, she had found it. Now they just had to figure out how to use the information without alerting Alexander to their discovery. Victoria touched the window glass, feeling the barrier between her and the outside world. Soon, she promised herself, soon she would know the truth about Sophia, about Alexander, about all of it. And then she would have to make a choice about what kind of life she really wanted to live. Dinner that evening was an exercise in restraint. Alexander had ordered the chef to prepare her favorite dishes, or rather, the favorites he had cultivated in her since their marriage. The wine was perfectly paired, the conversation carefully orchestrated, everything designed to remind her of the luxury and stability he provided. "I was thinking," Alexander said, swirling his wine glass, "that we should host a garden party next month to announce our plans for expanding the family." His eyes met hers across the table, challenging her to object. Victoria took a small sip of wine to hide her reaction. "Wouldn't it be better to wait, to make sure everything progresses naturally?" "Nonsense." Alexander's tone was light, but his knuckles whitened slightly around his glass. "I believe in speaking things into existence. Besides, it will be good for you to have a project to focus on. You've seemed a bit distracted lately." Before Victoria could respond, Maria appeared with the next course. As she set down the plates, she managed to brush against Victoria's napkin, dropping a folded piece of paper that fell silently into her lap. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Maria asked, her voice perfectly steady. Alexander waved her away, already launching into his plans for the party. Who would be invited? What would be served? How everything would be arranged to showcase their perfect life. Victoria nodded, at appropriate intervals, her mind on the paper burning a hole in her lap. It wasn't until after dinner, when Alexander retreated to his study for his nightly business calls, that Victoria had a chance to read the note. In the privacy of their bedroom-bathroom, one of the few places she knew wasn't monitored, she unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The message was brief, written in tiny, careful letters. Drive contained emails. S left because of pregnancy. He wanted control of baby. She ran. There's more. Need secure way to talk. Tomorrow, laundry room, 10 a.m. Victoria's hands shook as she flushed the note down the toilet. Sophia had been pregnant when she disappeared. The implications made her feel ill. No wonder Alexander was so insistent about starting a family now. A baby would tie her to him permanently, give him the ultimate leverage. She heard the study door open downstairs and quickly began her nighttime routine, removing her makeup, applying the expensive creams Alexander insisted she use, slipping into the silk nightgown he had chosen for her. By the time he came upstairs, she was the picture of wifely devotion. "Working late again?" she asked, turning down the bed just the way he liked it. "Just finalizing some details for the new security system," he said, loosening his tie. "Thomas had some excellent suggestions. Soon this place will be completely impenetrable." He smiled, but there was something predatory in his expression. "No one will be able to get in or out without my knowledge." Victoria forced herself to smile back, even as her heart raced. "That sounds wonderful. I always feel so safe here with you." Alexander crossed the room, pulling her into an embrace that felt more like possession than affection. "That's all I want," he murmured into her hair. "To keep you safe, protected, perfect." Later, lying awake in the darkness, Victoria listened to Alexander's steady breathing beside her. Her mind was racing with questions. What had happened to Sophia's baby? Had she managed to escape before giving birth? And most importantly, how had she managed to disappear so completely that even Alexander's resources couldn't track her down? The answers might be in those emails Maria had found, but they would need time to go through them carefully, without alerting Alexander's surveillance systems. The garden party he was planning could work in their favor. The preparations would give her legitimate reasons to meet with staff, to move around the estate more freely. She thought about the appointment with Dr. Harrison that Alexander had scheduled. 1 week. She had 1 week to figure out a plan, to find a way out before she ended up like Sophia, trapped not just by marriage, but by motherhood. A sound from outside caught her attention. The subtle click of the security cameras rotating, their red lights blinking in the darkness like artificial stars. Alexander had created a perfect system, but as Caroline had said, even perfect systems had weaknesses. The trick was finding them before it was too late. Victoria turned on her side, fitting herself into the position Alexander preferred, playing the role of the perfect wife even in sleep. But her mind was already in the laundry room tomorrow at 10 a.m., preparing for a conversation that could change everything. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that Alexander was awake too, his own mind working on plans within plans. As if sensing her thoughts, his arm tightened around her waist, pulling her closer in a gesture that felt less like protection and more like imprisonment. The laundry room hummed with the sound of industrial machines, their rhythmic washing providing cover for hushed conversations. Victoria had timed her arrival carefully, using the preparations for the garden party as an excuse to review linens with the household staff. Maria was already there, methodically folding sheets with practiced precision. "The emails were encrypted," Maria murmured, not looking up from her work. "But I used to work in cybersecurity before my ex-husband. I managed to access some of them." Her hands trembled slightly on the crisp white fabric. "There's so much, Mrs. Blackwood. About Sophia, about others before her, about the way he collects people." Victoria maintained her calm exterior, discussing table settings while processing Maria's words. "Tell me about Sophia," she whispered, reaching for another stack of linens. She was smart, really smart. She worked for a tech company that Alexander's firm was acquiring. That's how they met. Maria's voice was barely audible over the machines. The emails show how he isolated her, step by step. First it was concerns about her male colleagues, then about her family's negative influence. You sound familiar? Victoria's heart clenched, remembering how Alexander had gradually convinced her to cut ties with friends and family who didn't understand their lifestyle. What about the pregnancy? She found out right after the wedding. But something in his reaction scared her. There were emails to a lawyer asking about custody rights, about what would happen if... Maria glanced at the door, then continued even softer, if she tried to leave. The lawyer warned her that with Alexander's resources and connections, she'd never win a custody battle. So she ran before he could trap her legally, Victoria concluded, understanding flooding through her. But how? He has connections everywhere. Surveillance systems, private investigators. That's the thing, Maria said, her eyes finally meeting Victoria's. She had help. From inside his organization. Someone who knew how to cover tracks, create false trails, hide digital footprints. She paused, then added significantly, someone who still works for him. Victoria's pulse quickened. Who? Reynolds, Maria breathed. The estate manager. He's been here since before Sophia, saw everything happen. The emails suggest he helped her disappear, and... She hesitated. I think he's willing to help again. He's the one who made sure I was assigned to be your personal maid, after seeing how Alexander was starting to escalate. The implications were staggering. Reynolds, with his perfectly neutral expression and impeccable service, had been working against Alexander all this time. Had he been placing staff like Maria strategically, creating a network of allies right under Alexander's nose? The garden party, Victoria said suddenly, understanding blooming. All those preparations, people coming and going. It could be cover for... The laundry room door opened, cutting off their conversation. Alexander stood in the doorway, his expression pleasant but his eyes sharp as they took in the scene. Darling, he said smoothly, I've been looking for you. The wedding planner is here to discuss the party arrangements. I thought you'd want to be involved in every detail. Victoria forced a smile, hoping her face didn't betray her racing heart. Of course, I was just reviewing the linens for the guest tables. Maria has been so helpful with the preparations. Alexander's gaze swept over Maria, who kept her eyes downcast, the picture of servile efficiency. Yes, she's proving quite useful. His tone carried a hint of something dangerous. Though perhaps we should reassign her to general housekeeping. You shouldn't tire yourself with these details in your condition. Victoria felt her stomach lurch. He was already talking about her as if she were pregnant, asserting control over a child that didn't even exist yet. I enjoy being involved, she said carefully. It helps me feel productive. Such a devoted wife, Alexander smiled, extending his hand to her. Come, let's discuss the party. I have some very specific ideas about the announcement. As Victoria took his hand and let him lead her from the laundry room, she caught one last glimpse of Maria. The maid's face was composed, but her eyes held. A clear message. Time was running out. Walking through the house with Alexander, Victoria noticed things she hadn't seen before. The way Reynolds seemed to appear and disappear at strategic moments, how certain staff members communicated through glances and subtle gestures. Had Alexander created such a perfect system of control that it had generated its own underground? Resistance. I was thinking about names, Alexander said as they entered his study. For the baby. Family names, of course. Tradition is so important, don't you think? Victoria sat in the chair he indicated, feeling the walls of his study closing in around her. It's a bit early for names, isn't it? Nonsense. Alexander's smile didn't reach his eyes. It's never too early to plan for the future. Our future. He touched a control panel on his desk, and Victoria heard the subtle click of the study door locking. In fact, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about a lot of things, starting with your recent activities. Victoria's heart stopped. How much did he know? What had he seen? As Alexander settled into his chair, his expression shifting from benevolent husband to something much more dangerous. She realized she was about to find out exactly how far he would go to maintain his perfect world. The study had always been Alexander's domain, a testament to his power and control. Dark wood paneling absorbed the light, making the room feel smaller than it was. Behind his desk, monitors displayed feeds from various security cameras around the estate. Victoria forced herself to remain still under his scrutiny, channeling every ounce of the poise he'd insisted she cultivate. "You've been spending a lot of time with the staff lately," Alexander began, his voice deceptively casual. "Particularly Maria. I find myself concerned about the influence she might be having on you." Victoria's mind raced, but her face remained perfectly composed. "I'm just trying to be more involved in managing the household, like you've always encouraged. Maria has been helpful in teaching me the systems you've put in place." "The systems I've put in place," Alexander repeated slowly, testing each word. "Yes, I do have quite elaborate systems, don't I? Security, surveillance, staff management, everything designed to keep us safe, protected." He leaned forward. "Slightly. Tell me, darling, why did Caroline Harris give you a USB drive during your garden tour?" Victoria's heart stuttered, but years of Alexander's training helped her maintain her composure. "A USB drive? I'm not sure what you mean. Caroline was telling me about her travel plans, showing me photos of the places they'll visit in Europe." Alexander's smile was cold. "You've become such a good liar, Victoria. I've taught you well. Too well, perhaps." He pressed a button on his desk, and one of the monitors switched to a different feed, a high-angle view of the rose garden. The image zoomed in on Caroline's hand, slipping something into Victoria's pocket. "You see," Alexander continued, "the new security system Thomas helped me install includes some very impressive features. High-resolution cameras, directional microphones, advanced motion detection, all feeding into an AI system that flags suspicious behavior." He gestured to the screen. "Like this interesting little exchange." Victoria's mind whirled, looking for an escape route, but Alexander wasn't finished. "I had Reynolds search Maria's quarters, of course. The USB drive wasn't there. Neither was your laptop. Curious, isn't it?" His eyes bore into her, almost as if someone warned them I might look. A flash of movement on one of the other monitors caught Victoria's attention. Reynolds walking past the study door, his pace unhurried but purposeful. Was he listening? Did he know she was in here? "I don't understand what you're suggesting," Victoria said, letting a hint of confusion and hurt enter her voice. "I've been focused on the garden party, on preparing for our family. That's all that matters to me." "Is it?" Alexander stood, moving around the desk to lean against it directly in front of her. "Because I've noticed changes in you lately, small things. The way you watch the security cameras, how you've started building relationships with certain staff members, your sudden interest in the house's systems and protocols." His hand reached out to cup her cheek, the gesture loving but his grip just tight enough to hurt. "You remind me of someone else who started asking too many questions." Victoria knew. He was talking about Sophia, but she couldn't let him see that she knew. Instead, she leaned into his touch, playing the role of devoted wife. "I only want to be perfect for you, Alexander. Everything I do is to make you happy." His expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. "I know you do, darling. You're so close to perfect already. Just a few small adjustments needed." He released her face and returned to his chair. "Which is why I've made some changes to our plans. Dr. Harrison can see you tomorrow instead of next week. I've already called to arrange it." Victoria felt the trap closing around her. Once she was pregnant, she'd be completely under his control. She thought of Sophia, running while she still could, and understood with sudden clarity why she'd had to act so quickly. "Tomorrow?" she managed to say. "But what about the garden party preparations?" "Oh, I don't think we'll be having the party after all," Alexander said smoothly. "In fact, I think it's best if we spend the next few months here at the estate. Just us. No visitors, no distractions. Time to focus on what's really important." His smile was triumphant. "Our family." A knock at the study door interrupted them. Reynolds' voice came through the intercom. "Excuse me, sir, but there's an urgent call. From the Tokyo office. They're requesting your immediate attention regarding the merger." Alexander's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The Tokyo merger was worth millions. He couldn't ignore it, even for this. "We'll continue this discussion later," he said, standing. "Why don't you go rest, darling? Big day tomorrow." Victoria rose on shaky legs, feeling his eyes on her as she walked to the door. Just before she reached it, His voice stopped her. "Oh, and Victoria, I've asked Reynolds to escort you to your appointment tomorrow. I have some business in the city to attend to, but I'll meet you at the clinic. Remember, I always know where you are." As she left the study, Victoria's mind was already racing ahead. Alexander knew she was planning something, but he didn't know what. He was accelerating his plans, trying to trap her before she could act, but in doing so, he'd given her something precious: information. Reynolds had interrupted at exactly the right moment. He'd been listening, monitoring, perhaps even protecting her, and tomorrow he would be the one taking her to the clinic. Alexander wouldn't be there to watch her every move. It might be her only chance. But first, she needed to find Maria, to access those emails one last time. Because if Sophia had managed to escape even after Alexander suspected her, then maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. Victoria lay in bed that night, Alexander's arm draped possessively across her waist, her mind racing with possibilities. The moonlight filtering through the windows cast strange shadows on the walls, making the familiar bedroom feel alien and threatening. She needed to find a way to communicate with Maria and Reynolds before morning, but Alexander had made sure she wouldn't be left alone. He'd insisted they retire early, citing her need for rest before tomorrow's appointment. Now, he lay beside her, his breathing steady but not quite deep enough for true sleep. He was watching, waiting, probably expecting her to try something. A soft buzz from his phone broke the silence. Alexander stirred, checking the screen with a frown. "Tokyo again," he muttered, pressing a kiss to her temple that felt more like a warning than affection. "I need to take this. Don't wait up, darling. You need your rest." The moment he left the room, Victoria's mind shifted into high gear. She knew the cameras would be watching, knew Alexander would review the footage later. Whatever she did had to look innocent, natural. She waited 5 minutes, then got up slowly, as if restless. She pulled on her robe, the silk one Alexander had chosen, of course, and made her way to the ensuite bathroom. It was one of the few places in the house without cameras, a fact she'd confirmed through careful observation. The bathroom was massive, all marble and gold fixtures, with a spa tub big enough for 4 people. Victoria turned on the faucet, letting the water run to mask any sound. Then she pressed her ear to the wall that connected to the service corridor, waiting. 3. Soft taps answered her. Maria was there, waiting, just as they'd arranged through a series of subtle signals during dinner service. Victoria tapped back twice, then began her practiced routine of removing her makeup, knowing the cameras in the bedroom would show only her normal nighttime habits if Alexander checked later. As she wiped her face with an expensive cleansing cloth, Maria's voice came through the wall, barely audible above the running water. "Reynolds has a plan tomorrow during transfer, but you'll only have minutes." Victoria's hands remained steady as she applied her night cream, her voice equally soft as she replied, "Tell me. The clinic isn't far from where Sophia disappeared. Reynolds knows the route, the blind spots, but you'll need to be ready. No hesitation." Victoria checked her reflection in the mirror, ensuring her face showed nothing but peaceful preparation for sleep. What about after? There's a network, people who help, people like you, like Sophia. Reynolds can connect you, but then you're on your own. No contact, no traces. The implications hit Victoria hard. She would have to disappear, completely leave everything behind. But then she thought of the appointment tomorrow, of Alexander's plans for their family, and her resolve hardened. "The emails," she whispered. "Did you find anything else?" "Yes." Maria's voice became even softer. Sophia wasn't the first. There were others before her. Women who disappeared. Some with help, some without. Alexander has a pattern. When they start asking questions, when they show signs of independence, She paused, and Victoria could hear her struggling to find the right words. "He accelerates. His plans. Like he's doing with you now." Victoria thought of the sudden rush to get her to the clinic, the way Alexander was closing in, tightening his control. She'd seen this pattern before, she realized, in the way he'd rushed their wedding, their move to the estate, each step carefully planned to eliminate any chance of resistance. "There's something else," Maria added, "in the emails. About why. He's so obsessed with having children. It's not about family or legacy. It's about control. A child would give him legal rights, connections that would make it almost impossible for you to ever truly escape. That's why Sophia ran when she did. She knew once the baby was born." The sound of footsteps in the bedroom cut off their conversation. Victoria quickly shut off the water, emerging from the bathroom looking perfectly groomed and slightly sleepy. Alexander stood by the window, his phone still in his hand. "Everything all right, darling? You were in there quite a while." "Just having trouble sleeping," she said, moving to join him. "Nervous about tomorrow, I suppose." He pulled her close, his arm around her waist, firm and unyielding. "No need to. Be nervous. Everything will be perfect. You'll see. Soon we'll have everything we've always wanted." Victoria leaned into him, playing her part perfectly while her mind raced ahead to tomorrow. She thought of Sophia, of the other women who had faced this moment of choice. Some had made it, some hadn't. Tomorrow, she would find out which category she belonged to. "Come to bed," Alexander said, leading her back to their perfectly arranged sheets. "Tomorrow is an important day, the beginning of our real life together." As she lay back down, feeling Alexander's arm reclaim its position around her waist, Victoria silently agreed. Tomorrow would indeed be the beginning, but not the one Alexander had planned. In less than 12 hours, she would either find her freedom or lose it forever. Through the window, she could see the moon sliding behind clouds, casting the room into deeper shadow. Somewhere out there, Sophia had found her way to freedom. Tomorrow, Victoria would follow in her footsteps, one way or another. Dawn arrived with a fog that crept up from the vineyard, wrapping the estate in a ghostly shroud. Victoria stood at the bedroom window, already dressed in the outfit Alexander had laid out the night before. A modest blue dress and pearl earrings, the perfect ensemble for a doctor's appointment. Her reflection in the glass looked calm, collected, every hair in place. Inside, her heart was thundering. Alexander was in his study, handling last-minute details before heading into the city. He'd been unusually attentive during breakfast, watching her every move, commenting on everything. She ate. "You need to keep up your strength," he'd said, adding another piece of toast to her plate. "Everything changes after today." The sound of footsteps made her turn. Reynolds stood in the doorway, his expression professionally neutral. "The car is ready, Mrs. Blackwood, whenever you're prepared to leave." Victoria nodded, picking up the small handbag Alexander had approved for today's outing. He'd gone through it himself this morning, removing her phone and credit cards. "For safekeeping," he'd said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You won't need them at the clinic." As she followed Reynolds down the grand staircase, she was acutely aware of the cameras tracking their movement. Alexander would be watching, analyzing every gesture, every expression. She had to maintain the perfect facade of compliance until the very last moment. Alexander met them in the foyer, impeccable in one of his $1,000 suits. "I'll see you at the clinic, darling," he said, kissing her cheek. His hand lingered on her arm, squeezing slightly. "Reynolds will take good care of you until then." "Of course," she replied, her voice steady. "Drive safely." She watched as he got into his Mercedes, the sleek black car pulling away down the long driveway. Only then did she turn to Reynolds, who was holding open the door of the estate's less conspicuous Audi. "We should leave now, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his tone professional but his eyes conveying urgency. "We don't want to be late." The drive began in silence, the fog growing thicker as they wound down the estate's private road. Victoria watched the iron gate swing closed behind them through the rear window, remembering the first time she'd passed through them as Alexander's wife. She'd thought she was entering a fairy tale. Now she knew she'd been entering a prison. They drove for 20 minutes, following the route Alexander would expect them to take toward the clinic. Reynolds maintained a perfectly professional demeanor, but Victoria noticed how his eyes constantly checked the mirrors, monitoring the traffic around them. "Mr. Blackwood is very thorough in his preparations," Reynolds said suddenly, his voice carefully measured. "He has people watching the clinic, the roads, monitoring all the obvious escape routes." He paused, then added, "Just as he did with Mrs. Sophia." Victoria's heart jumped at the mention of Sophia's name, but she kept her voice calm. "You knew her well?" "I've served the family for many years, Mrs. Blackwood. I've seen patterns emerge." His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "The fog today reminds me of another morning, very much like this one. Easy to lose one's way in weather like this. Easy to disappear." Victoria understood what he was telling her. This was the same route, the same conditions under which Sophia had escaped. History was offering her a chance to repeat itself. "The clinic is still 20 minutes away," Reynolds continued conversationally. "But there's a gas station coming up in 2 minutes. We'll need to stop. The fog's quite bad. Better to fill up now. Safety first, as Mr. Blackwood always says." Victoria's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment Maria had told her about. She thought of Alexander, probably already tracking their progress through the car's GPS, confident in his control over every variable. The gas station appeared out of the fog like a ghost, its fluorescent lights creating a hazy glow. Reynolds pulled up to a pump, his movements unhurried, natural. "I'll just be a moment, Mrs. Blackwood. Please remain in the car. Mr. Blackwood's instructions." He got out, began the process of filling the tank. Victoria sat perfectly still, watching in the side mirror as Reynolds casually checked his phone. 1 minute passed, 2. Then his voice came, barely a whisper through her slightly opened window. "Now, back exit, through the shop. Don't run. Walk calmly. Someone's waiting." Victoria's hand was on the door handle when a flash of movement caught her eye. A black Mercedes turning onto the station's access road, still distant but approaching fast. Alexander had suspected something after all, had been following them, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. Victoria saw 2 futures crystallize before her, one of perfect submission, of a life mapped out and controlled down to the smallest detail, of a child raised in a gilded cage. The other was uncertain, dangerous, but filled with the possibility to have freedom. She thought of Sophia making this same choice years ago, of Maria escaping her own prison, of all the women who had faced this moment of decision. The Mercedes was getting closer, its outline becoming clearer through the fog. Victoria opened the car door. The fluorescent lights of the gas station shop cast strange shadows as Victoria walked. Didn't run, mustn't run through the aisles. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps remained measured, deliberate. Alexander had taught her well how to maintain composure under pressure, an irony not lost on her now. Through the foggy windows, she could see the Mercedes pulling into the station, its sleek black form like a predator emerging from mist. Alexander would be watching the front entrance, expecting her to make an obvious escape attempt, but Reynolds had known this, had planned for it. A middle-aged woman in a denim jacket was studying the coffee selection, looking for all the world, like any other morning commuter. But when Victoria passed by, the woman spoke without looking up. "Blue sedan, backlot, keys in ignition, drive north on County Road 27. Don't stop until you reach the red barn." Victoria continued past, her fingers trembling as she picked up a bottle of water, a natural action, something any traveler might do. Through the security mirror mounted in the corner, she could see Alexander entering the station, his movements controlled but radiating tension. He headed straight for Reynolds, who was still calmly finishing with the gas pump. The back door was marked employees only. Victoria pushed through it just as she heard Alexander's voice, sharp with fury. "Where is she?" The morning air hit her face, heavy with fog and possibility. The blue sedan sat exactly where the woman had said, its nondescript form almost invisible in the grey morning light. Victoria slid into the driver's seat, her movements fluid and practiced, just as she'd been taught during her safety driving lessons, another of Alexander's controlled preparations that would now aid in her escape. As she turned the key, she heard the shop's front door slam open. In her rearview mirror, she saw Alexander emerging, his perfect composure finally cracking as he scanned the lot. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second through the fog and glass, his wide with disbelief, hers steady with determination. Then she was driving, the sedan moving smoothly through the fog like a ghost. Alexander's shout of rage was cut off by distance and the sound of the engine. In her mirror, she could see him running for his Mercedes, but Reynolds had positioned the estate's Audi perfectly, accidentally blocking the fastest route through the gas station. The fog swallowed her as she turned onto County Road 27, her hands steady on the wheel even as her mind raced. She knew Alexander would be right behind her once he managed to maneuver around Reynolds. She knew he would have already called ahead, activating his network of contacts. She had minutes maybe before the net started closing. But for the first time in months she was moving under her own power, making her own choices. The wedding ring on her finger caught the weak morning light, and without hesitation, she pulled. She'd often dropped it in the cup holder. The diamond made a hollow sound as it hit the plastic, a small but definitive rejection of everything it represented. The red barn emerged from the fog like a sentinel, its weathered sides a stark contrast to the precise perfection of Alexander's estate. Victoria pulled around to the back, where another car waited. This one a dusty green Subaru with mud on its wheels and a rack on top holding camping gear. Perfect camouflage for a woman on a weekend adventure, nothing like the polished luxury Alexander insisted upon. A figure emerged from the barn, the coffee-shopping woman from the gas station, already holding out a bag. "Change quickly," she instructed, her voice clipped and professional. "Everything you need is in here: ID, cash, burner phone. Memorize the contact numbers, then destroy the phone. Your next contact will find you in 3 Rivers. Until then, you're on your own." Victoria pulled the blue dress over her head, replacing it with jeans and a flannel shirt that would have made Alexander recoil in horror. As she changed, the woman continued her rapid instructions. "Stay off main roads, don't use credit cards, don't call anyone you know, don't trust anyone who says they're part of the network unless they have the right recognition signals. And most importantly, don't stop moving. He'll have people everywhere watching bus stations, hotels, airports." "Like he did with Sophia?" Victoria asked, lacing up hiking boots that felt strange after months of designer heels. The woman's expression flickered. "Sophia made it. Others didn't. The first 48 hours are crucial. After that..." She gestured to the Subaru. "The car's clean, but dump it in 2 days anyway. Next contact will have a new one." The sound of an approaching engine cut through the fog. The woman tensed, then relaxed as a familiar figure emerged. Reynolds, looking as composed as ever despite what must have been a dramatic scene at the gas station. "Mr. Blackwood is currently experiencing some unexpected vehicle trouble," he said, his proper butler's diction incongruous with the situation. "But that won't delay him for long. You need to leave, Ms. Hayes." He handed her a passport, and Victoria saw her own face next to her new name. "I took the liberty of securing this some time ago just in case it proved necessary." Victoria took the passport with shaking hands. "Thank you, both of you. I know what you risked." "No time for thanks," the woman cut in. "Every minute you spend here is another minute he has to close the net. Go now." Victoria climbed into the Subaru, its worn seats and practical interior a world away from the luxury she was leaving behind. As she started the engine, Reynolds stepped forward one last time. "Ms. Hayes," he said formally, "I believe you'll find that the fog provides excellent cover for disappearing. Send to the mountains. It would be quite difficult to follow someone in these conditions." His proper facade cracked slightly, showing genuine concern. "Be safe, be smart, and whatever you do, don't look back." The fog swallowed the barn and its occupants as Victoria drove away, following the rough track that led into the mountains. In her mirror, she could see the first glimpse of sun breaking through, burning away the morning mist. Somewhere behind her, she knew Alexander was already mobilizing every resource at his disposal to find her. But for now, she was ahead of him. For now, she was free. Back at the gas station, Alexander Blackwood stood perfectly still, his usual mask of control fractured by rage and disbelief. The security footage played on the station's ancient monitor, showing Victoria walking calmly through the shop and out the back door. Even in grainy black and white, her composure was perfect, exactly as he'd trained her to be. "Play it again," he commanded the nervous station attendant. His voice was quiet, controlled, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the counter. On the screen, Victoria moved like a ghost, every step measured and graceful. No hesitation, no obvious signs of flight. She'd learned her lessons well, too well. He'd taught her how to move through high society, how to maintain poise under pressure, how to hide her true thoughts behind a perfect smile. Now she'd used those very skills to slip through his fingers. His phone buzzed continuously. Updates from his security team, his private investigators, his network of contacts throughout the region. But the fog had done its work, swallowing any trace of which direction she'd gone after leaving the station. Reynolds stood nearby, the picture of professional concern. "Perhaps, sir, we should return to the estate, make calls from there, coordinate the search more effectively." Alexander's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he studied his estate manager's carefully neutral expression. For the first time, he wondered just how many of his perfect systems had been quietly working against him. How many of his carefully chosen staff had been part of this betrayal? "The estate can wait," he said softly, dangerously. "First, I want to know exactly how this happened. Every detail, every person involved." His hand slipped into his pocket, fingering the small white box he'd been saving for after the clinic appointment, the one containing another pair of silver scissors, meant as a reminder of his authority. No one disappears completely. Sophia didn't, not really. And Victoria won't either. Reynolds maintained his professional demeanor, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardening, a resolution. "As you say, sir, though perhaps Mrs. Blackwood simply needed some time to herself. The pressure of planning the garden party, the sudden medical appointment." "The garden party," Alexander interrupted, a new thought striking him. "Caroline Harris, she started this, didn't she, with that USB drive?" He pulled out his phone, already dialing, but the call went straight to voicemail. The Harrises were supposedly already en route to Europe. Convenient timing that now seemed far too calculated. The station's door chimed as Maria entered, her uniform immaculate despite the early hour. "Mr. Blackwood, the clinic called. They wanted to confirm if you'd like to reschedule Mrs. Blackwood's appointment." Alexander stared at her, seeing for the first time how her submissive demeanor might have been as much of a performance as Victoria's perfect wife routine. How many others had been playing roles in his carefully constructed world? "Sir," Reynolds prompted, "your Mercedes is ready, though in this fog, perhaps it would be better to wait." "No more waiting," Alexander snapped. "Call the airport. Have them prepare the helicopter. I want eyes in the air as soon as this fog lifts." He turned to the station attendant. "I need every security recording from the past week, every customer, every car." His phone buzzed again, another update from his security team, reporting no sign of Victoria on any of the main roads. But Alexander wasn't worried, not yet. He had resources, connections, technology that could track a person's every move. Victoria had nothing, no phone, no credit cards, no friends or family to run to. He'd made sure of that, systematically isolating her just as he had with Sophia. Sophia. The name burned in his mind. She'd thought she'd escaped too, had managed to stay hidden for years, but Alexander had never stopped looking, never stopped gathering information. He knew things about her new life that she thought were safely secret. The small town in Oregon, the quiet job at a local library, the daughter she'd named Hope. He hadn't acted on this knowledge, content to simply know he could reach out and shatter her peace anytime he chose. But now, with Victoria's betrayal burning in his gut, perhaps it was time to remind everyone that his reach extended far beyond the estate's walls. "Sir?" Reynolds' voice interrupted his thoughts. "The fog is starting to lift. The helicopter crew is standing by." Alexander straightened his tie, his mask of control sliding back into place. "Good. Have them start with the mountain roads. Victoria always did love the mountains. Another weakness I should have corrected." He turned to Maria, who flinched slightly under his gaze. "Go back to the estate. Tell the staff to prepare for my return. I want everything perfect when Victoria comes home." As his staff scattered to do his bidding, Alexander watched the sun burning through the last wisps of fog. Victoria thought she had escaped, just as Sophia had thought she was free. But what neither of them understood was that his kind of power, his kind of control didn't end at the estate gates. He would find her, and when he did, he would show her exactly what happened to people who tried to break free from his perfect world. The mountain roads twisted through forests of ancient pines, each turn taking Victoria further from the manicured perfection of her old life. The Subaru handled the rough terrain easily, its worn seats and muddy exterior a stark contrast to the luxury vehicles she'd grown accustomed to. She found herself relaxing into the simple functionality of it, embracing the freedom of anonymity. The C. Burner phone contained only 3 numbers, each labeled with a single letter. She'd memorized them as instructed, her mind automatically using the techniques Alexander had taught her for remembering important business contacts. The irony wasn't lost on her. Through the trees, she caught glimpses of the valley below, now clear of fog. The morning sun illuminated everything in sharp detail, and more than once she spotted a helicopter in the distance, methodically searching the area. Alexander would be coordinating from above, she knew, using every resource at his disposal to track her down. At a small mountain stream, she stopped briefly, following the woman's instructions to change the Subaru's license plates, with the spare set hidden under the seat. The cold water helped clear her head as she splashed her face, washing away the last traces of the expensive moisturizer Alexander had insisted she use. Her new ID identified her as Claire Hayes, a freelance photographer from Seattle. The backstory was simple but thorough, exactly the kind of person who might be driving through mountain roads alone, taking pictures of autumn foliage. She had a website too, she discovered, already populated with landscape photos and a modest portfolio. Someone had been preparing this escape route for a long time. A rustic general store appeared around the next bend, its wooden sign weathered and authentic in a way Alexander would have despised. Victoria, now Claire, pulled in, knowing she needed supplies but aware of the risk. The woman's warning echoed in her mind. Alexander would have people watching everywhere. The store's interior smelled of coffee and pine, its shelves stocked with practical items rather than luxury goods. An elderly man dozed behind the counter, a local news station playing quietly on an ancient TV mounted in the corner. She was selecting basic groceries when the news program caught her attention. A reporter stood outside Alexander's estate, looking professionally concerned. Where sources say Victoria Blackwood, wife of prominent businessman Alexander Blackwood, has gone missing. Mr. Blackwood has expressed deep concern for his wife's well-being, citing recent unusual behavior. The image cut to Alexander, his face a perfect mask of worried husband. "My wife has been under tremendous pressure lately. She's in a delicate condition, and I'm deeply concerned about her state of mind. I just want her to come home where she'll be safe." Victoria's hands trembled as she watched. He was playing it perfectly, painting her as unstable, positioning himself as the concerned husband rather than the controlling force she was fleeing. Anyone who saw that broadcast would think they were helping by reporting her whereabouts. "Terrible thing," the store owner commented, suddenly awake. "Pretty young thing like that running off. Husband seems real worried." Victoria forced herself to shrug casually. "Some women just can't handle responsibility, I guess," she said, pitching her voice slightly lower than normal, adding a hint of judgment to her tone. It worked. The owner nodded in agreement, already losing interest in her. She paid cash for her supplies, then added a local paper and some tourist maps, as Claire the photographer would. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something that made her blood freeze, a reflection in the store's security mirror of a black SUV pulling into the parking lot. Through the tinted windows, she could see men, in suits exactly the kind of private security Alexander employed. The store had a back door past the refrigerator cases, marked with a faded "Employees Only" sign. Without hesitation, Victoria walked calmly toward it, her posture relaxed even, as her heart raced. She'd learned long ago in Alexander's world, that confidence was the key to going anywhere unquestioned. She slipped through the door just as the store's bell chimed, announcing the entrance of Alexander's men. The back lot was empty except for a few employee vehicles and a delivery truck idling as the driver unloaded boxes. Victoria moved quickly but naturally toward her car, keys already in hand. Through the store's window, she could see the security team showing her photo to the owner, who was already pointing toward the back door. The Subaru started smoothly, and she pulled out onto the mountain road as if she had every right to be there. In her rearview mirror, she saw the men emerging from the store, running toward their vehicle. But she had a head start, and more importantly, she knew something they didn't. During her careful study of the tourist maps inside, she'd noticed a network of old logging roads branching off the main route. Roads that wouldn't appear on GPS, roads that even Alexander's helicopter would have trouble following through the dense forest canopy. She turned onto one of these roads now, the Subaru's all-wheel drive handling the rough terrain easily. The dust she kicked up would be visible for a few minutes, but the thick trees would soon hide her trail. Behind her, she could hear the SUV's engine roaring as it gave chase. But Victoria had spent months listening to Alexander's boasts about his security team's tactics, about how they thought and operated. She knew they would expect her to run flat out, to panic. Instead, she maintained a steady, deliberate pace, taking each turn with precision rather than speed. The road forked, and she chose the path that led deeper into the forest rather than the more obvious route toward the next town. The sound of the pursuing vehicle grew fainter, then faded entirely. Still, Victoria kept driving, following the winding logging road as it climbed higher into the mountains. She wasn't safe, wouldn't be safe for a long time, but she had won this round. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, she allowed herself a small smile. Alexander had taught her so much about strategy, about thinking several moves ahead. Now she was using those lessons to outmaneuver him at his own game. The estate felt different without Victoria, its perfect surfaces taking on a cold, museum-like quality. Alexander stood in their bedroom, his bedroom now, watching the sunset paint the vineyard in shades of blood and shadow. The search teams had lost her trail in the mountains, the helicopter unable to maintain visual contact through the dense forest canopy. His phone lay silent on the bed, its screen dark. He'd spent the day coordinating search efforts, mobilizing contacts, setting up monitoring of every transit hub within 500 miles. But Victoria had vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving nothing but questions and rising fury. In her wake, a soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he commanded, not turning from the window. Reynolds appeared in the reflection, still maintains his impeccable butler's posture despite the day's events. "Sir, the police have arrived to take formal statements about Mrs. Blackwood's departure." Alexander's lips curved in a cold smile. The police were just another resource to be used, another tool in his arsenal. "Show them to my study. And Reynolds, have Maria prepare coffee. The good coffee, not the staff blend." "I'm afraid Maria is indisposed, sir," Reynolds replied, his tone perfectly neutral. "She appeared quite distressed by today's events and has taken to her bed." Alexander turned slowly, studying his estate manager with new eyes. How long had Reynolds been working against him? Had he helped Sophia too? The thought made his hands itch for the silver scissors in his desk drawer. "Indisposed," he repeated, softly. "How unfortunate. Perhaps we should call a doctor. I'd hate for any of our staff to be unwell." Something flickered in Reynolds' eyes. Concern, warning. But his expression remained professionally blank. "I've taken the liberty of calling a replacement from the agency. She'll arrive tomorrow morning." Alexander waved his hand dismissively, already thinking ahead. Maria would be dealt with later once the immediate situation was handled. Right now he needed to focus on Victoria. In his study, 2 police detectives waited, a man and woman, both wearing the slightly ill-fitting suits of public servants. Alexander noted their cheap shoes, their obvious deference to his wealth and position. Easy to manipulate. "Mr. Blackwood," the male detective began, "we understand your wife left for a medical appointment this morning but never arrived at the clinic. Can you tell us about the circumstances leading up to her disappearance? Alexander sank into his leather chair, letting his mask of concern settle perfectly into place. Victoria has been unstable lately. The pressure of our social obligations, the expectations of our position, it all became too much for her. I tried to help, arranged for the best doctors, but... He paused, allowing a careful note of emotion to enter his voice. I'm worried she might harm herself. The female detective's pen scratched across her notepad. Did Mrs. Blackwood leave any indication of where she might go? Family? Friends? That's the strange thing, Alexander said, spreading his hands helplessly. She's been so isolated lately, pushing everyone away. It's part of why I've been so concerned. He reached into his desk drawer, withdrew a file. These are records from her therapist, documenting her increasingly erratic behavior. The detectives examined the papers. Papers Alexander had prepared months ago, just in case they became necessary. Everything properly documented, officially stamped, creating a pattern of instability that would make any investigation focus on Victoria's mental state rather than her reasons for running. We'll need to speak with the staff, the male detective said. The estate manager, any personal maids. Of course, Alexander agreed smoothly, though I should mention that her maid, Maria, seems to have been quite affected by all this. Perhaps give her a day or two to recover before questioning. The detectives exchanged glances, already losing interest. Just another domestic drama in a wealthy household, a troubled wife running from imagined problems. Exactly as Alexander had planned. After they left, he remained in his study, watching security footage from the past week on multiple screens. Victoria moving through the house, talking with staff, everything looking perfectly normal on the surface. But now he could see the subtle signs, the way certain cameras had brief technical issues at key moments, how staff members created small distractions at crucial times. His perfect system had been corrupted, turned against him by the very people he'd trusted to maintain it. The thought made his jaw clench with fury. A notification popped up on his phone. One of his private investigators, reporting movement on one of Victoria's old college friends' credit cards. A large cash withdrawal in a small town 3 states away. He smiled, already reaching for his phone to mobilize a team. Victoria thought she had escaped, thought she could use his own lessons against him. But she had forgotten the most important thing he'd taught her. In his world, everything and everyone could be bought, tracked, controlled. Let her run for now. Let her taste the illusion of freedom. It would make bringing her back all the sweeter. The sun had fully set now, leaving the study in shadows broken only by the glow of security monitors. On one screen, Maria's empty room showed signs of hasty packing. On another, Reynolds moved through his evening duties with practiced efficiency, betraying no sign of his role in the day's events. Alexander opened his laptop, fingers flying over the keys as he accessed a hidden folder. Inside were years of accumulated data, surveillance photos, financial records, personal details about Sophia's new life. He'd been saving them, waiting for the right moment to remind her that no one truly escaped his influence. Perhaps it was time to pay her a visit. After all, she might have some idea where Victoria would run. A small smile played across his lips as he began making arrangements. The pieces were already in motion, the net beginning to close. Victoria would learn what Sophia had nearly discovered, that his perfect world had no exits, only temporary escapes. 3 Rivers was a small town that prided itself on being unremarkable, the kind of place tourists passed through on their way to somewhere else. For Victoria, now fully embracing her identity as Claire Hayes, it was perfect. She'd arrived as instructed, parking the Subaru behind a family-owned motel that had seen better days. The room was basic but clean, nothing like the luxury she'd grown accustomed to. She found herself appreciating its simplicity, the honest wear on the furniture, the slight musty smell that spoke of real life rather than carefully manufactured perfection. Following the instructions from the burner phone, she'd ordered coffee at the local diner 3 times a day, sitting at the counter, and making small talk about her photography work. Each time, She watched for the signal she'd been told to expect, some sign that her next contact had arrived. It was on her second day, just as the sun was setting, that she noticed the waitress, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and knowing eyes. She'd seen her before, working the afternoon shift, but this time something was different. The woman wore a small silver pendant that caught the light, two intertwined circles, the symbol she'd been told to watch for. "Rough weather for photography," the waitress commented as she refilled Victoria's coffee. Her name tag read Beth. Victoria gave the response she'd memorized. "Sometimes shadows make the best pictures." Beth's expression didn't change, but she placed the check face down on the counter. "Take your time, honey. No rush." When Victoria turned the check over, she found not a bill but a note. "Storage Unit 23, Red Pine Facility. Combination 184427. Be there at midnight. Bring only what you can carry." She spent the remaining hours in her motel room, methodically, preparing. The few clothes she'd acquired were practical, nothing that would draw attention. She transferred essential documents to a small backpack, then systematically destroyed anything that could be traced. Just before midnight, she slipped out of the motel, walking rather than driving. The storage facility was on the outskirts of town, its red metal units stark against the night sky. Unit 23 opened silently when she entered the combination. Inside, she found Beth waiting with another woman, younger, with close-cropped dark hair and alert eyes. Neither spoke as they gestured her inside, closing the unit behind them. "Phone," the younger woman said, holding out her hand. Victoria surrendered the burner without question. The woman dropped it into a bag of others, all similarly disposable. "Alexander's men were in town this morning," Beth said quietly. "Showing your picture, asking questions, they're getting closer." Victoria's heart jumped, but she kept her voice steady. "How did they track me here?" "They didn't," the younger woman replied. "They're searching everywhere, following every possible lead. It's only a matter of time before they find something real." Beth opened a metal cabinet, revealing clothes, supplies, and another set of identification documents. "You'll need to change everything again. Hair, clothes, documentation. The Claire Hayes identity is compromised." "How do you know?" Victoria asked, even as she began sorting through the supplies. The women exchanged glances. "Because we've done this before," Beth said finally, "many times, for women like you, running from men like him." "Like Sophia," Victoria said, watching their reactions. The younger woman's eyes sharpened. "You know about Sophia. I found her emails, and I know Alexander hasn't stopped looking for her." Victoria paused, then added, "He knows where she is, in Oregon." Beth's face went pale. "Are you sure?" Victoria nodded. "He has surveillance photos, records. He's been watching her, waiting. And now..." She swallowed hard. "Now I think he might use her to get to me." The younger woman was already pulling out a phone, not a burner, but something more sophisticated. "We need to warn her, get her moving again." "No," Beth said sharply. "If he's been watching her this long without acting, moving her now might trigger him. We need to be smarter." She turned to Victoria. "Tell us everything you know about his surveillance methods, his resources. Every detail matters." For the next hour, Victoria detailed everything she'd learned about Alexander's systems, his security protocols, his network of informants, the technology he used to track and monitor. The women listened intently, occasionally making notes or exchanging significant looks. "He's escalating," the younger woman said finally. "The police reports, the media coverage. He's painting you as unstable, creating a narrative that makes him the concerned husband rather than the controlling abuser." "Classic tactics," Beth agreed, "but he's being more aggressive than usual, more public." "Because of the baby," Victoria said quietly. "He wanted to get me pregnant, to have that hold over me, just like with Sophia." Understanding dawned on Beth's face. "That's why she ran when she did, and why you had to leave now." The younger woman was already moving, pulling out maps and documents. "We need to change the plan. The route we had. A setup for you isn't secure enough if he's this motivated." "What about Sophia?" Victoria asked. We can't just leave her exposed. Beth's expression was grim. We'll handle Sophia. You need to focus on disappearing completely. No more motels, no more towns. We're taking you off the grid entirely. She opened another cabinet, revealing outdoor gear, camping equipment, weather-appropriate clothing, supplies for surviving in wilderness areas. Hope you're ready for some real photography, Claire. You're about to get very familiar with the backcountry. Victoria looked at the gear, understanding the plan. Alexander's surveillance systems, his network of informants, his technology. None of it would work in true wilderness, but surviving there would require skills she'd never needed in her life of luxury. I'll learn, she said firmly, already reaching for the new supplies. Whatever it takes. The younger woman nodded approvingly. Good, because from here on out everything gets harder, and you'll need to be ready for anything. Through the storage unit's small window, Victoria could see the first hint of dawn approaching. Soon she would begin another transformation, taking on yet another identity in her journey away from Alexander's control. But this time, she wouldn't be running blindly. This time, she had allies who understood exactly what she was facing. The private jet cut through the night sky, its luxury interior a perfect match for Alexander's standards. He sat in a hand-tooled leather seat, reviewing surveillance photos on his tablet while his team of private investigators delivered their latest reports. We traced her to 3 rivers, one of them said, sliding a photo across the polished table. It showed Victoria, or rather someone matching her general description, at a local diner. But the trail goes cold there. She's being helped by professionals. Alexander zoomed in on the image, noting the changes in her appearance, the careful way she carried herself. Even in grainy surveillance footage, he could see how she'd adapted his lessons about blending in, about moving without drawing attention. What about the network? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. Any progress tracking their infrastructure? Another investigator cleared his throat nervously. They're sophisticated, sir. Multiple layers of protection, constant movement. We've identified some patterns, but every time we get close, they shift tactics. Alexander's fingers tightened on his tablet, but his face remained calm. And our other target? A new photo appeared on his screen. A small-town library in Noe, Oregon, its brick facade warm and welcoming. A woman was leaving the building carrying a stack of books. Even after years away from his influence, Sophia still had the graceful posture he'd insisted upon, though her style had become decidedly more casual. She maintains her routine, the first investigator reported. Work at the library, home to her daughter, occasional outings with a small circle of friends. No sign she knows she's being watched. Alexander studied the image of Sophia's daughter, a girl of about 7, with her mother's delicate features and determined expression. Hope, they'd named her, such an obvious choice, almost defiant in its symbolism. Any unusual activity since Victoria's departure? Changes in pattern, unexpected visitors? Nothing yet, sir. But we've increased surveillance. As requested, if anyone tries to warn her. Good. Alexander set down the tablet, staring out the jet's window at the darkness below. Maintain distance for now. I don't want to spook her. Just remind our local assets to stay alert. The investigators nodded, understanding the implicit threat. Alexander had spent years building his network, placing people in strategic positions across the country. In Sophia's small town alone, he had 3, a bank teller, a police officer, and a nurse at the local clinic, all well paid to keep watch and report anything unusual. As his team retreated to the back of the jet, Alexander pulled up another file. On his tablet, the police report about Victoria's disappearance. The detective he'd spoken with had done an excellent job following his suggestions, crafting a narrative of a troubled woman fleeing imagined problems. The media had picked up the story exactly as planned, their headlines generating public sympathy for the concerned husband searching for his unstable wife. His phone buzzed with a message from Reynolds. Staff situation handled. Attached was a photo of Maria's empty room, cleared of personal belongings. She'd vanished sometime in the night, likely helped by the same network that had engineered Victoria's escape. Alexander allowed himself a small smile. Let them think. They'd won that small victory. Maria's disappearance only confirmed his suspicions about how deep the corruption in his household went. Now he knew where to look, who to watch, how to identify the weak points in his perfect system. The jet began its descent into a small private airfield in Oregon. In less than an hour, he would be in Sophia's town, though she wouldn't know it. Not yet. First, he needed to understand the network that had helped her disappear, the same network now hiding Victoria. A notice popped up on his tablet, one of his financial algorithms flagging unusual activity. He opened the alert, finding a pattern of small transactions across several states, each just below the threshold that would trigger normal monitoring. Clever, but not clever enough. His systems were designed to detect exactly this kind of evasion technique. Sir? One of the investigators approached cautiously. We've received word from our contact at Three Rivers. The motel room was cleared out, but they found this. He handed over a small evidence bag containing strands of dark hair, Victoria's natural color, before the dye job she'd used to disguise herself. Alexander held the bag up to the light, remembering how Victoria's hair had felt between his fingers, how he'd controlled even that aspect of her appearance. Have it analyzed. I want to know everything. What kind of dye was used, where it was purchased, any trace elements that might indicate location. Yes, sir. The investigator hesitated. There's something else. The motel's security cameras caught someone watching the room, a woman matching the description of one of Sophia's known associates from 7 years ago. Alexander's pulse quickened, but his voice remained steady. So the networks are connected. Sophia's helpers reaching out to assist Victoria. He turned back to the window, watching the approaching lights of the small Oregon town. Which means they'll try to warn her when they realize I'm getting close. The jet touched down smoothly on the private airstrip. A black SUV was already waiting, its windows tinted to match the darkness of the night. Soon he would begin the careful process of tightening the net, using Sophia's peaceful life as leverage to draw Victoria out of hiding. Patience, he murmured to himself, straightening his tie as the jet's door opened. Everything returns to its proper place eventually. The cool Oregon air carried the scent of pine trees and small-town simplicity. Somewhere out there, Sophia was living the life she thought she'd earned, while Victoria was running through wilderness she was ill-equipped to handle. Both of them thinking they'd escaped his influence, never realizing they were still moving, through a world he controlled. Alexander stepped into the waiting SUV, his plans already shifting and adapting. Let them think they were free. Let them believe their network of helpers could protect them. In the end, it would make their return to his perfect world all the more complete. The mountain air was crisp with approaching winter, each breath visible in the pre-dawn light. Victoria, now using the name Sarah Russell, adjusted her backpack as she followed her guide along a narrow trail. After 3 weeks in the wilderness, her body had adapted to the physical demands, developing strength she never knew she possessed. We'll reach the cabin before nightfall, her guide said. Jenny was a former park ranger who specialized in helping women disappear into the vast network of backcountry trails and hidden shelters. You've picked up the skills quickly. Most city folks take longer to adjust. Victoria smiled grimly, remembering Alexander's insistence on physical perfection. All those personal training sessions, designed to mold her body to his standards, had inadvertently prepared her for this escape through rough terrain. I had a good teacher, she replied, then clarified, recently. Jenny, there's something you need to know. The man I'm running from, he's not just looking for me, he knows where Sophia is. Jenny stopped abruptly, turning to face Victoria. How sure are you? He has photos, surveillance reports. He's been watching her for years, waiting for the right moment to use her as leverage. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice though they were miles from civilization. He's obsessed with control, with proving no one can truly escape him. And now that I've run, he'll make his move, Jenny finished, her expression grim. Come on, we need to get to the cabin. There's a secure satellite phone there, we can warn the others. They hiked in tense silence, moving faster now, Victoria had learned to read the wilderness, to spot game trails and natural landmarks. She understood now why the network had chosen this route for her. The endless mountains, the unmarked paths, the sheer vastness of the wilderness. It was the perfect antithesis to Alexander's world of technological control. The cabin appeared as the sun was setting, a small structure built to blend into the landscape. Inside it was basic, but efficiently organized, with solar panels for power and a hidden communications setup. Jenny went straight to the satellite phone, while Victoria secured the perimeter as she'd been taught. Through the window, she could see the last rays of sunlight painting the mountains in shades of gold and shadow. Somewhere out there, Alexander's helicopters were still searching, his network of informants still watching. No answer from the key Oregon team, Jenny reported, her voice tight with concern. Could be nothing. Communication blackouts are normal for security, but with what you've told me... He's there, Victoria said with sudden certainty. In Oregon. He's making his move. She could picture it clearly. Alexander arriving quietly, setting his pieces in place like a chess master preparing for the endgame. Jenny was already punching in another number. We need to change plans. If he's using Sophia to flush you out, our entire northern route is compromised. Victoria sat heavily on a wooden chair, her mind racing. He'll expect me to run further away, to keep moving north into more remote areas. She looked up at Jenny. So maybe I should do the opposite. What do you mean? Alexander thinks in patterns, in systems. He'll have his people watching all the usual escape routes, the places women like me typically run. Victoria stood, energy coursing through her despite the long day of hiking. But what if instead of running away, I went toward the danger, to Oregon, to Sophia? Jenny stared at her like she'd lost her mind. That's exactly what he wants. No, Victoria corrected. He wants me to run scared, to be chased until I'm exhausted and desperate. He wants to herd me into a trap. But if I choose to go there on my own terms, if I warn Sophia myself... It's too risky, Jenny protested. You'd be walking right into his web. I lived in his web for 2 years, Victoria said quietly. I know how it works, how he thinks, how he plans. She touched the satellite phone. And I know something. He doesn't. The full extent of your network, the resources you have, the people willing to help. Jenny was silent for a long moment, considering. You're talking about using his own tactics against him, drawing him out, making him think he's in control while actually setting our own trap, Victoria finished. But we'll need help. Not just the usual network, but everyone who's ever escaped him, everyone who knows how he operates. The satellite phone crackled with static. Then a voice came through. Beth, from 3 Rivers. We've lost contact with our people in Oregon. All communication channels are dark. Victoria and Jenny exchanged looks. Time was running out. How quickly can you get me to Oregon? Victoria asked. Jenny's expression hardened with determination. Give me an hour to make some calls. If we're really doing this, we're going to need every ally we can get. Victoria nodded, then moved to the cabin's window. The mountains were dark now, the stars emerging in a clear sky. She thought of Sophia, of the daughter she'd fought so hard to protect, of all the women who had fled Alexander's perfect world, leaving pieces of themselves behind. It was time to stop running, time to face the architect of their fear on ground they chose. As she watched Jenny coordinating with the network, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced since the day she'd first met Alexander. True power, not the illusion of it he'd used to control her. The game was changing, and this time, she would write the rules. The small Oregon town looked exactly like the surveillance photos, its main street a picture of small-town American life. Alexander sat in an upscale coffee shop, positioned to watch the library across the street. His appearance had been carefully cultivated to blend in, expensive but casual clothes, reading glasses, a laptop open to business documents. Sophia emerged from the library right on schedule, her movements confident and relaxed. 7 years of freedom had changed her, stripped away the careful polish he'd insisted upon. Her clothes were simple, practical, her hair cut in an easy style that would have never met his standards. Yet she moved with a grace that was entirely her own, no longer the practiced elegance he'd demanded. His phone buzzed with an update from his security team. No contact from target network. Subject maintains normal routine. Alexander smiled slightly. Of course they hadn't reached her yet. He'd made sure their usual communication channels were blocked, their local contacts neutralized. Sophia had no idea that her carefully constructed peace was about to shatter. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed as Reynolds entered. Alexander had summoned him from the estate, needing his estate manager's practiced efficiency for what was to come. "Everything is prepared," Reynolds reported, his tone professionally neutral. "The house is secured, the staff replaced with our own people. The daughter's school has been quietly informed of potential custody issues." Alexander nodded, taking a sip of his perfectly prepared coffee. "And our other arrangements?" "In place. The local police have been given the appropriate documentation about Mrs. Blackwood's mental state. They're prepared to assist in her recovery, should she appear." Through the window, Alexander watched as Sophia chatted with a colleague, laughing at some shared joke. She looked happy, settled. It almost seemed a shame to disrupt her life. Almost. "Sir," Reynolds said carefully, perhaps a more subtle approach. "No." Alexander's voice was soft but final. "Victoria needs to understand that there are consequences, that every woman who's ever fled my protection will face the same choice, return willingly or watch their carefully built lives crumble." He stood, straightening his casual jacket. "It's time. Make the call." Reynolds hesitated for just a fraction of a second, so brief anyone else would have missed it. But Alexander caught it, filing it away for future consideration. Then his estate manager was moving, efficient as always, dialing a number on his phone. Across the street, Sophia's phone rang. Alexander watched as she answered, saw the exact moment when the color drained from her face. Through the coffee shop window, he could read her lips forming the word no over and over. "Sir," Reynolds reported, his phone still at his ear, "she's been informed of the situation. The choice is hers." Alexander watched as Sophia ended the call, her hands shaking, as she fumbled her phone back into her bag. Her colleague was asking if she was all right, but Sophia was already moving, practically running toward her car. "Have our people at the school ensure young Hope remains in class," Alexander instructed. "Her mother needs time to make the right decision." He gathered his things unhurriedly, knowing there was no need to rush. Sophia would drive home, find the envelope he'd had delivered containing surveillance photos of her daughter, her friends, her entire life. She would discover that her bank accounts had been frozen, her job suddenly under review, her rental agreement mysteriously flagged for investigation. More importantly, she would learn that Victoria was somewhere in the wilderness, running from the same fate. The choice would become clear: cooperate in bringing Victoria back or watch her daughter's life become collateral damage in a war she'd thought was long over. "The network will know we're making our move," Reynolds pointed. "Out. They'll try to intervene. Let them," Alexander said calmly, watching Sophia's car speed away. "Every resource they commit to protecting Sophia is one less available to hide Victoria, and when they realize the choice is between saving one woman or protecting another," he smiled coldly, "well, that's when we'll see what their principles are really worth." He turned away from the window, already mentally shifting to the next phase of his plan. "Have the jet ready. Once Sophia makes her decision, things will move quickly." Reynolds nodded and left to make arrangements. Alexander remained for a moment, studying his reflection in the coffee shop window. Behind him, the small town continued its peaceful routine, unaware that its quiet surface was about to be shattered by the ripples of his influence. Victoria thought she had learned his methods, thought she could use them against him, but she'd forgotten the most important lesson he'd taught her. True power wasn't in the obvious displays of control, but in the quiet manipulation of circumstances until escape became impossible. Let her think she was choosing to come to Oregon. Let her believe she was setting a trap rather than walking into one. In the end, it would make her return to his perfect world all the more complete. Outside, clouds were gathering, promising rain. Alexander adjusted his glasses, checked his reflection one last time, then stepped out into the street. It was time to remind everyone that in his world, there was no such thing as escape. Only temporary illusions of freedom that he allowed to exist until they no longer served his purpose. The Oregon rain fell in a steady drizzle, turning the small town's streets into a maze of reflections and shadows. Victoria sat in the back of an unmarked van, surrounded by women she'd never met but who shared a common bond. They had all escaped Alexander's world of perfect control. Sophia's house is being watched, reported Lisa, a former security expert who'd helped 3 women escape abusive situations. Alexander's people are everywhere, but they're looking for obvious approaches. They don't expect us to be this close already. Victoria nodded, studying the tactical map spread across their mobile command center. In the week since she'd left the mountain cabin, the network had mobilized in ways she hadn't thought possible. Women from across the country had emerged from their new lives, bringing skills and resources Alexander would never suspect they possessed. "What about Hope?" she asked, thinking of Sophia's daughter. "Safe," answered another woman, Monica, whose own escape had involved reprogramming security systems. "We got to her school before Alexander's people could establish full control. She's with our people now, though Sophia doesn't know it yet." Victoria felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Alexander's primary leverage was already neutralized, though he didn't know it yet. And Sophia? Holding on, but barely. Lisa pulled up footage from a hidden camera, showing Sophia pacing in her living room. Alexander's systematic. He's destroying everything she's built here. Bank accounts, job, reputation, classic isolation tactics. "Just like he did with all of us," someone else added softly. Victoria studied Sophia's image, seeing the tension in her posture, the way she kept checking her phone. She's waiting for instructions from Alexander, expecting him to tell her how to help trap me. "Which is exactly what we're going to use," Monica said, pulling out a laptop. "Because while Alexander's been focused on pressuring Sophia, we've been busy with something else." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up complex diagrams and code. "Remember those emails you found? The ones that helped you understand what he did to Sophia?" Victoria nodded, remembering the USB drive Caroline had slipped her in the rose garden. "They were just the beginning," Monica continued. "Alexander keeps everything, every plan, every manipulation, every detail of how he controlled his victims. He thinks his security is perfect, but," she smiled grimly, "let's just say he never expected his targets to include someone who helped design corporate security systems." The laptop screen filled with documents, photographs, financial records, an empire of control laid bare. Victoria's breath caught as she saw her own file, thick with surveillance reports and carefully documented manipulations. "It's all here," Monica said quietly. "Every woman he's controlled, every tactic he's used. Enough evidence to destroy him. Completely. But he doesn't know we have it," Victoria finished, understanding dawning. "He thinks he's still in control of the narrative." Lisa nodded. "Which is why he's being so bold with Sophia. He thinks his position is secure, that no one would believe women like us over someone like him." A ping from one of their surveillance feeds drew their attention. Alexander's black SUV was pulling up to Sophia's house right on schedule. "Time to move," Lisa announced, and the van's occupants sprang into action with practiced efficiency. "Victoria, are you ready?" Victoria checked, her appearance in a small mirror. She looked nothing like the perfect wife Alexander had created. Her hair was its natural color, her clothes practical rather than elegant, her face free of the expensive makeup he'd insisted upon. She looked like herself, perhaps for the first time since she'd met him. "Remember," Monica said, handing her a small device that looked like a normal phone, "everything is recording. Every word, every threat, every attempt at manipulation, and it's all being broadcast to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country." Victoria slipped the phone into her pocket, feeling its weight like a shield. "What if he suspects?" "He won't," Lisa assured her. "Men like Alexander are so convinced of their own power that they never imagine their victims could turn it against them. Besides," she added with a grim smile, "he'll be too focused on the fact that you've apparently walked right into his trap." Through the van's window, Victoria watched as Alexander emerged from his SUV. Reynolds following with perfect professional precision. Even from a distance, she could see the satisfaction in Alexander's stance, the confidence of a man who believed he was about to reclaim his property. "Sophia just got a text," Monica reported, monitoring the communications. "Alexander's summoning her to meet him, telling her it's time to prove her loyalty." Victoria took a deep breath, centering herself. "Then it's time for me to prove mine." The women around her, survivors, warriors, sisters in an battle Alexander never saw coming, nodded in understanding. They had all faced this moment in their own ways, had all found the strength to break free from the perfect cages built around them. "We're with you," Lisa said softly. "Every step." Victoria opened the van's door, stepping out into the rain. The drops felt like benediction on her skin, washing away the last traces of the perfect wife Alexander had tried to create. As she walked toward Sophia's house, her steps were steady and sure. Behind her, an invisible network of survivors mobilized, their carefully laid plans falling into place. Before her, Alexander waited, still believing he was the architect of this moment. He had no idea that his perfect world was about to shatter, brought down not by a single escape attempt, but by the collective strength of every woman he'd tried to control. Victoria smiled as she approached the house, knowing that cameras were recording every step. It was time for Alexander to learn that true power didn't come from control. It came from letting go, from surviving, from finding strength in the very freedom he'd tried to deny them. Alexander stood in Sophia's living room, taking in the modest furnishings with barely concealed disdain. The life she'd built here was so far beneath the standards he'd set for her, yet she'd chosen this ordinary existence over his perfect world. Soon she would remember the cost of such choices. Reynolds positioned himself near the window, his usual efficiency somehow altered, though Alexander couldn't quite identify how. No matter. Once Victoria was secured, there would be time to deal with any lingering disloyalty among his staff. "She's here," Reynolds announced, his voice carefully neutral. Through the window, Alexander watched Victoria approaching. She'd abandoned all the refinements he'd insisted upon, yet somehow she moved with more confidence than ever. The sight made his jaw clench with irritation. The door opened, and Sophia entered first, her face pale but composed. She'd been summoned to witness this moment, to remember what happened to those who thought they could escape his influence. "Right. On time," Alexander said smoothly, turning to face Victoria as she stepped into the room. "Though I must say, darling, your appearance has deteriorated since you left." Victoria's smile was unexpected, calm, almost amused. "Hello, Alexander. You've been busy while I was away, threatening a child. That's low even for you. Merely ensuring everyone understands the consequences of their choices." He moved closer, noting how she stood her ground. "Speaking of choices, I assume you're here to make the right one, to come home where you belong." "Actually," Victoria said, her voice steady, "I'm here to show you something." She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen. "Tell me, do you recognize these documents?" Alexander's blood ran cold as he saw his own private files displayed on the small screen, files that should have been secured behind layers of encryption in his personal server. "Interesting reading," Victoria continued. "Detailed records of every woman you've controlled, every technique, every manipulation, all documented with your usual perfectionism." She smiled again, and this time there was steel behind it. "Did you really think Sophia was the only one with technical skills?" Alexander's mind raced, calculating possibilities, threats, counter-moves. "Those files are encrypted, secured." "Were secured," another voice said, and Monica stepped into the room, her laptop open and active. "Amazing how much easier it is to crack security systems when you helped design them. Remember me, Alexander? I was one of your first projects, before Sophia." More women were entering now, faces he recognized from his careful records. Lisa, whose security expertise he'd dismissed as hobby. Rachel, whose financial acumen he'd tried to suppress. Each of them carrying evidence of his methods, his manipulations. "What do you want?" he demanded. fighting to maintain control of the situation. "Want?" Victoria laughed softly. "We don't want anything from you, Alexander. We're not here to negotiate, we're here to end this, all of it." As if on cue, police sirens became audible in the distance. Through the window, Alexander could see news vans arriving, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky. "Everything you've done," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "Every tactic, every threat, every moment of control, it's all being broadcast live. Your perfect world is being exposed, Alexander, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." He moved then, reaching for her with the same commanding grip that had always worked before. But other hands caught him, held him back. The women he'd tried to control now forming a barrier between him and his target. "Reynolds," he snapped, "do something." But his estate manager simply shook his head. "No, sir, not this time." The sirens were louder now, and Alexander could see police cars pulling up outside. His phone was buzzing continuously. Probably his lawyers, his security team, all the people he paid to maintain his illusion of control. "You can't do this," he said, but his voice had lost its authority. "I gave you everything, made you perfect." "No," Victoria said quietly. "You tried to make us into reflections of your own perfectionism. But look around, Alexander. Look at what we've accomplished without you. Sophia built a life filled with real love. I found strength I never knew I had. Every woman here has discovered who she really is, not who you tried to force her to be." The front door opened, admitting police officers and FBI agents. Alexander watched in disbelief as they approached, warrant in hand. "Mr. Blackwood," one of them said formally, "we have some questions about certain financial transactions and about a pattern of behavior that's been brought to our attention." As they led him toward the door, Alexander looked back at Victoria. She stood among the other survivors, no longer the perfect wife he'd crafted, but something far more powerful, a woman who had broken free and helped others do the same. "It's over," she said simply. "Your perfect world was always just an illusion, and illusions shatter when exposed to the truth." Through the window, he could see reporters gathering, cameras flashing. His carefully constructed reputation, his image of the successful businessman and concerned husband, was dissolving in real time. The last thing he saw before they led him away was Sophia hugging her daughter. Hope, who had somehow appeared unharmed despite his careful plans. The child's laughter echoed in his ears, a sound of genuine joy that had never existed in his perfect world. Victoria watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a quiet sense of completion. Around her, women who had once been victims were comforting each other, sharing stories, building connections that would last long after this moment. "What happens now?" Sophia asked softly, holding Hope close. Victoria looked at the others. Lisa, Monica, Rachel, all the women who had risked their new lives to help end Alexander's control. "Now," she said, "we build something real, something perfect in its imperfection." Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds. A new day was dawning, not just for them, but for every woman who would now be spared from Alexander's version of perfection.